Hey guys, welcome to a video where we're going to be highlighting some of the grammar and some of the words that are significant for understanding the book of Romans. And in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the words and expressions in chapter 1. And the first word I want to highlight is a word that appears in verse 2, and it's right here. It's pra epengelata. And if we were to read chapter 2 or translate verse 2 reads, which he promised beforehand, because we can see the little prefix there at the beginning, right? Pro, and then the word for promised. So he promised beforehand, through the prophets, through his prophets, in the scriptures, in the holy scriptures. And the reason I want to point out this word is because of its prefix, the pro. Pro is a prefix that appears a lot of times in Romans. And this word is talking about what God promised in the Old Testament, but that was fulfilled in the New Testament. But this little word pra is the same word, the same prefix that's attached to words that we'll see a lot of times in the book of Romans. Words like foreknow or predestine. Even the term election that comes up, especially in chapters 9 through 11, has this idea of something that God did beforehand. And sometimes people get kind of hung up on that and they're bothered by it. We shouldn't. It's a biblical term. It's a biblical concept. But sometimes it has to do with the fact that the gospel was planned and ordained and fulfilled by the direct hand of God. This happened through Old Testament events and prophecies, and in fact, a lot of it was, I should say all of it was planned. Depends on the context. Here he's talking about Old Testament prophecies, but there's other words that are used like this that talk about something God did before time even began. But this is an important prefix as it appears throughout the book of Romans, so I wanted to draw your attention to that. Another neat little word appears in chapter 4, oristhenitos, and it's from the verb orizo, which means to determine or to declare. And if we take a look at the end here, we can see the participle morpheme, the the, that's the aorist passive morpheme, right? And it takes on this case, the genitive singular case, because it's modifying his son, the words his son up here. But in any case, if we read verse 4, it talks about how he was declared or determined to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness from or by the resurrection of the dead. This is another very powerful verse in the opening of Romans. It's not that Jesus became the Son of God at the resurrection, but the resurrection was the verification that indeed he was more than just a good man or a good prophet. He was the Son of God. And the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the fact that he rose from the dead, just as he said he would do. And so this is a really neat word here that shows that Jesus Christ was proved to be who he said he was. And what's interesting is in the passive voice, which means God did this to him. This is, in a sense, Christ's passive obedience being rewarded. He passively submitted to the will of God when he was crucified, and God actively raised him up. He was declared. He was affirmed to be the Son of God by God the Father. If we scroll down to verse 11, we're going to see the Apostle Paul say something that sometimes people think he's backtracking a little bit here. He says, for I desire to see you, in order that, metado is the word for share, charisma, when someone's charismatic, they have, that could be a reference to a number of things, but in the Bible, it has to do with a gift set, specific gifts. And so he says, I want to share a gift with you, and then he modifies it a spiritual gift in order that you might be strengthened. Now, what's interesting here is that when you read this in context, sometimes it seems like the Apostle Paul is backtracking. He's saying, I want to come and be a blessing to you. And then in verse 12 he says, well, what I mean to say is that I want to be strengthened through the mutual faith of you and me. But I don't think he's backtracking here because already these two words are very telling. Metado is share. Now, something that is shared is something that already supposes kind of an interaction, a mutuality. But then the word charisma, especially as we're going to see it used later in the book, is this idea that it's a gift that's specifically for the edification of the whole body. And the whole body has different gifts. We each have a gift that we can use to contribute to the well-being of our church. But the word itself supposes that it's only useful in as much as it's shared and used among the body. Later on, when he talks about how gifts needs to be used, he says, use your gifts according to the measure of faith. In other words, all of us can do something. We need to find out what we can do, and we need to focus on doing that well for the good of those around us. Down in 16, he's going to say that he's not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes. And then he says to the Jew first and to the Greek. So to the Jew first here, really we're going to see him basically lay out why it's to the Jew first in the whole book of Romans. But the reason it's to the Jew first has to do with the advantage that the Jew has in having the divine oracles, in being a descendant of Abraham, and being called out of Egypt, and being led by Moses to start their nation of Israel and have the Ten Commandments, for instance. The Jew has all of this, and that's why the gospel goes to the Jew first. That's what happened in the first century, and then eventually it spread out to the Gentiles. But the gospel is for the Jew first, and it's also the Gentile. He's going to talk about in this letter how even though we're in the stage of the Gentile reception of the gospel, there's coming a time when the gospel once again will be centered among the Jews. It will have included the Gentiles, but it will be centered among the Jews when the Messiah returns and all of Israel is converted to believe the gospel that Jesus is the Messiah, he died for our sins, and he rose from the dead. When we scroll down to verse 18, we see apokaluptetai, which is from apokalupto. It means to reveal. And we see that it is passive. The wrath of God, orge theu, the wrath of God, is revealed. It's passive. But I also want to point out something about the tense. It's the present tense. And so we know usually when we think about the wrath of God, orge theu, we think about something that will happen in the future, right? It will be revealed. But here he says, present tense, it is revealed. The tense of this verb, as well as when we follow through the context, he talks about all of the consequences that result from rejecting God out of hand. There are certain consequences that can be seen presently that fall upon the ungodly. And so an interesting way to describe the wrath of God is something that is presently revealed as evidence that God is God and man is not. Sometimes we think, well, everything that's perceived about God is always by faith and it's not visible. Well, yes, a lot of that is true, but it's also true that God can be understood and seen and perceived presently through how he operates in the world, through divine blessing and divine wrath as it's presently revealed. So interesting to point out here that this is present tense and it's passive. Right along with this concept, down here in verse 20, as it talks about the aorata is invisible things, right? For the invisible things of him, from the creation of the world, by the things that are made, Nuamena kathoratai. Nuamena talks about comprehension or understanding. They're understood. Kathoratai means clearly perceived. And so in other words, it's not like, well, the concept of God, as he's described in the scriptures, some abstract thing that you learn through faith, but it's not necessarily reasonable. What he's telling us here is it's actually reasonable and observable to a degree. These things are clearly understood. So as we're working through this first chapter, keep in mind that everything he's describing is evidence that the God of the Bible is the true God of the universe. Little expression that appears over here towards the end of verse 20 is eis ta plus the infinitive. This is really common in the New Testament. Sometimes we get in one track and we think, oh, eis, it's a preposition. It means into or in or something. But actually, a lot of times you're going to see eis ta with the infinitive and its purpose or result. And here it's talking about more result, I think, than anything, resulting in that they are without excuse. So that they are without excuse. But it's talking about more result. So keep in mind, when you look at a preposition, look at the whole expression in order to get at the meaning. Okay, eis ta plus an infinitive is result or purpose. Down here in verse 24, after it talks about man rejecting God out of hand and how he replaces God, he still worships things, he just doesn't worship God. It says, well, therefore, he delivered. Okay, this is aorist, active, indicative from paradidomi, which means to hand over, deliver over. Wherefore he delivered them, God, in the lusts of their heart unto uncleanness. and to do shameful things with their own bodies. All right? And so paredoken is God delivered them over. What's interesting, what he describes in the previous verses here is there things that they decided to do. They decided to reject God from their knowledge. They replaced God. They changed the truth of God. And as he says throughout this chapter, they're the ones who practice these vices. And it says God delivered them over. And what's interesting is we see throughout this book human responsibility and divine sovereignty. That man makes a choice. There are certain consequences for that choice, but it's God who is making sure those consequences fall upon the person. And this is how we see the wrath of God presently revealed. God is delivering them over. So God is very active in meting out the consequences of sin. Sometimes there seems to be a delay, but consequences always come, and that is how God's just wrath is manifested. When we scroll down to verse 27, he's talking here about homosexuality specifically, and it says, likewise the men with the men, they left the natural use of the woman, and they burn in their lust towards one another, men with men, working out, doing shameful things. And then down here, over here, it talks about they received in themselves the consequence of their error. Okay, so what's interesting here is the meaning of en autes, received in themselves. What does that mean? Well, it's a little obscure, but he could be talking about the physical diseases and consequences that result from this kind of sin. Or he could be talking about, just as God has stamped within our nature the fact that we are a man or a woman, when you deny that to the point where you even practice sexually something that's contrary to nature, something very fundamental has struck against your nature, and it is now deeply embedded within your very being as a consequence of rejecting so far out of hand God that you deny your own nature. This is very strong terminology here, whether it's physical or spiritual or both. There are errors that take place within the person when they reject God to the degree that those described in 27 have done. And just one more time in verse 28, we see another verb. It's the same verb. That's paredoken. It talks about God again delivering them over so that they just do whatever they want to do without really any checks and balances that God, through His Spirit, provides to all men. We just need to be attentive.